Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover Chapter 9 from the Helicopter Flying Handbook. This is all about basic flight maneuvers. Normally I give the standard disclaimer that, hey, we're going to only talk about things that are specific to helicopters, which is pretty much this whole chapter. All right. So, when you look at a helicopter, we have our 4 fundamentals of flight. And what are those? Straight and level, turns, climbs, and descents. So pretty much every maneuver can be thought of as some combination of these 4 fundamentals. What's going to happen while you're flying? What are some good practices? Move things slow. I like to say slow, smooth, small. Especially with a helicopter. Somewhat with an airplane as well, but especially with a helicopter. You want to go really slow. Otherwise, you end up just oscillating all over the place. Anticipate changes in performance. If it's a hot day and you're at a higher altitude, you're not going to get the same performance. I was just flying today. I actually just had a solo this morning. I had a first-time solo student in a plane. And yesterday I had another first-time solo student. So I was hoping to get 2 in a day, but I'll still take 2 back-to-backs. Well, it's been a little warm lately, so the performance is not quite what it usually is in those aircraft. Now, when it comes to your basic maneuvers, you will see things like this. If I make a left turn, my torque increases. So I need more anti-torque. Also, when I turn either direction, I'm taking my lift, which was vertical, and making some of that horizontal, which decreases that vertical lift, which means I need to check up the collective a little bit if I want to make a level turn. Other things, if you pull back on the cyclic, your torque decreases and your rotor speed increases. This is something that you will definitely notice when you're doing auto rotations. So when you flare at the bottom of an auto rotation, you will notice that the rotor speed goes up, which is a good thing. Conversely, if you push forward on the cyclic, then the rotor speed tends to slow down. You always want to have a way out and know where the winds are. Even more so than a standard airplane, you should really know what the winds are doing. Normal landings require higher power settings. Keep that in mind. Airplane is kind of opposite of that. Okay, so different flight maneuvers, straight and level. How does that work? Well, it's pretty simple. You want to maintain forward flight. In order to do that, you have to push forward on the cyclic. And you want to go at the same altitude. So you're mostly looking outside. In general, no matter what aircraft you're flying, you should be mostly looking outside and glancing at the instruments inside to just verify that you're doing what you think you're doing. Especially helicopters, they tend to have less instrumentation than airplanes. Often you don't have these fancy things like gyros in place. So you want to pick a point in front of you and fly to that point. How do you know that you're level? Well, you can cross-check with your altimeter and also your vertical speed indicator, which you probably have. If you're descending and you don't want to descend, but you're okay with the speed that you're flying at, you just need to pull up on the collective a little bit. If you're climbing and if you're okay with the speed, you just drop the collective a little bit. It's that simple. After you've flown for a little bit in a particular helicopter, you'll say, oh, well, I want to go 60 knots and level flight. In the Schweitzer, it's probably 22 inches of manifold pressure is about how much power I need. Other things you want to do is keep the helicopter in trim. And this is while you're flying straight and level and also in turns. And you want to avoid, slipping and skidding in a turn. So in a properly coordinated turn, the horizontal component of lift exactly balances out inertia. And you hit the wind dead on, just like you would in a plane. If you're in a slip, you've got too much horizontal component of lift. So you need to adjust with your anti-torque pedals. And a skid is the opposite. You have too much inertia that is more than the horizontal component of lift. So the tail is kind of skidding to the outside of the turn, if you will. How do we avoid that? Most helicopters have a yaw string. Some also have a turn coordinator, just like you would find in an airplane. Some have both. Some have just one. Typically, they're going to have a yaw string. Yaw string works very well. And it's very simple. If you're coordinated, the string is straight up. If you're in a slip or a skid, then it's not straight up. Now, it works opposite to a turn coordinator with the ball, where you step on the ball. In the case of a string, you drag the string. So here, the string is to the right. I would apply left pedal in order to pull it back to the center. So when I'm turning, I'm doing a level turn. What are some common errors? I bank too much and I don't apply more power. Or I slow way down. I start pulling up as I turn. What about climbs and descents? Climbs and descents. If you want to climb, pull the collective. If you're flying something like a Schweitzer, how much collective can you pull? As much as it'll give you. If you're flying something like a Robinson, they have limitations and there's a chart you have to consult and say, hey, am I allowed to pull this much power today based on the weather? And the answer is probably not, because the Schweitzer is it's kind of a hot rod helicopter. You got 180 horsepower to play with. The Robinson is derated and underpowered. So you have a lot less power to play with. So if you want to go up at the same airspeed, you just pull some collective. You can also pull back on the cyclic, and that will cause a climb, but at a lower speed. How do you descend? Well, guess what? You lower the collective, and then you will descend at approximately the same airspeed. Of course, when you do that, you change the amount of anti-torque pedal that you need. If you raise the collective, you up the torque. So that means more pedal. Normally, you're adding left pedal if you have a standard helicopter. What if you're descending? Well, now you're going to add right pedal because you need less anti-torque, if you will. And then we have all of these maneuvers that are based on those 4 fundamentals, such as a vertical takeoff into a hover. So what's the technique here? Again, biggest thing, you want to look straight out in front of you. Now, if you look on my YouTube channel, you will see I have some videos in a sim saying, hey, this is how you hover a Schweitzer S300 CBI. And I would recommend you have a look at those if that's the helicopter that you're going to fly. So, what's the general technique? You want to look out in front of you and you start raising the collective until the helicopter starts to get light on the skids. Now, in the case of the Schweitzer, since it doesn't have a governor, you're going to have to pay attention to the tack, make sure you're not going to overspeed the thing. And again, I would say watch some of those videos. I want to get into all the specifics here. But as it starts to get light, you just very slowly, remember my 3 S's, slow, smooth, small. You just very slowly continue to raise that collective until you're in the air. Now, you want to be sitting straight up in the helicopter so that you can feel what's going on. If you start to slide to the right, you want to be able to feel that and gently, with small movements, push the cyclic to the left to stop that drift. Same thing if it's going forward or aft, or if it's yawing. Very quickly, after just a few hours of flight, you will get to a place where you automatically correct for these problems. So you take off. Now, what controls the height of your hover? Well, that's how much collective you put in. We talk about ground effect. And remember, ground effect is not an on or off kind of thing. The closer you are to the ground, the more ground effect you have. So the further you are from the ground, the more power you're going to have to pull to hover at that altitude. It's one reason why when you come in to land a helicopter from a hover, you have to continue to drop the collective. It's very common, especially for students, to get a couple inches in the air and they just get stuck there because the ground effect became greater, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can't quite get those last couple inches and get down onto the ground. And then people get impatient and they drop the collective and they kind of plop it on the ground, which is not what you want. So how do you hover? Pretty much you pull it up into the air and you're looking out in front of you. You pick a point, and if you see any kind of drift, you correct for that. If you're going too low, you pull up a little bit of collective. If you want to go higher in the hover, don't get extreme. Sometimes I'll see guys that are hovering like 6 foot in the air. Like I could literally walk under the helicopter while it's hovering. Not that I would do it. That's a bit extreme. Of course, you also don't want to be an inch in the air and then you hit a little bit of a bump, and then that's bad too. Okay, so hovering turns. How do we turn in a hover? Usually we do what we call a pedal turn. So if you want to turn a certain direction, you push that pedal and you yaw in that direction. It's that simple. You want to stop turning, you push the other opposite pedal till it stops. Things to keep in mind. If I push the pedal, in particular, if I push the left pedal, that is my power pedal, I'm going to require more power to be diverted to the tail rotor, which means the helicopter is going to drift down. So I need to anticipate that I might need to add a little collective. And there's a little note here on this picture that says just what I just said. Left pedal causes the need for increased throttle or increased collective, if you will. Now, the book talks about, crazy things you can do when hovering. Most of the time we want to hover forward. So you just gently ease that cyclic forward. Again, slow, smooth, small. So you're going forward a little bit. You might need a little bit of collective because you just changed some of that vertical lift to horizontal lift in order to get that hover to start going forward. You can hover sideways. We try not to do that too much. And why is that? Well, I always have fun, especially with fixed wing pilots, where I will hover taxi sideways because it really weirds them out. And if you really want to weird them out, you can start hovering backwards. That is also not a great idea in most cases because you can't see very well and you've got things like a tail rotor back there and you don't want to hit the tail by accident. Also, the skids are not designed to contact the ground in that direction. You're supposed to be going forward if you slide it on the ground. So going sideways, if you catch a skid, you could roll it. Going backwards, if you catch a skid, you could have a tail strike, and you also can't see very well to the back. So that's something to avoid most of the time. But it's a nice skill builder. You can go down a taxiway and transition from forward to sideways to backward to the other sideways and back to forward hover taxiing. Great skill builder. And of course, what happens when you put in the pedals? You put in the pedals, then the helicopter might try to climb or descend. Plus, you change the direction of the wind if there's any significant wind. So it's a constant thing where you're always making small, smooth, and slow adjustments on the controls of a helicopter. Okay. That's hover taxiing. Sometimes you want to do an air taxi. What's an air taxi all about? An air taxi is when you are hovering a little higher in the air, realistically, maybe 25 feet in the air. They say below 100 feet. That's a pretty high hover or air taxi. It's basically flying from one place to another. It's something you might do if you have to cover a large distance on an airport, or maybe there's some sort of obstacle in the way. And that's something we do when we want to go a little bit faster. Surface taxi is something you should only do if your helicopter has wheels, which most of them don't, especially training helicopters. How does that work? You basically push forward on the cyclic and you start to move. Why would you want to surface taxi? Well, if you have wheels, it requires a lot less power. Less power also means you're not going to kick up as much dust and things. Okay, other things you want to do. You want to do a takeoff from a hover. How does that work? Again, I would encourage you to have a look at some of those videos I have on YouTube on how to fly a pattern in a S300 CBI, if that's the helicopter you're going to fly. Generally speaking, you're going to start pushing forward. So you're going to push forward a little bit, and you're going to start creeping forward, and then walking forward, and then sprinting forward. Now, as you speed up, as we learned in the helicopter aerodynamics chapter, the rotor becomes more effective. In particular, the front part of the rotor becomes more effective. So that generates some lift, and you get what's sometimes called blowback, where it tries to lift the nose of the helicopter. In order to counteract that, you can either push forward a little bit more and or drop the collective a little bit. So in the Schweitzer, I tend to drop the collective a little bit so that I don't climb out prematurely. Then you get going a little bit faster. As you get going a little faster in the Schweitzer, I like to say at 45 knots, I will push and pull. I'm going to push forward on the cyclic and start pulling the collective. And again, I'm going to pull as much power as I can get. I'm going to climb out at 50 some knots in that helicopter. The Robinson's a little bit different. It's kind of backwards. And in the Robinson, well, first of all, you can't just pull as much power as you'd like. But in the Robinson, you tend to start moving, get going a little bit faster. And when you get to about 45 knots, you bump the cyclic aft, and that will start the climb out. But you probably can't put in more power because you already had maximum power allowed in the Robinson. So it's a little bit different. So it looks kind of like this picture here. So you start out in the hover, push forward a little bit, and you start accelerating, and then eventually you're in forward flight. You can also start from the surface. Why would you do that? Well, maybe there's some snow or dirt, and you don't want to sit in a hover and have a whiteout or a brownout. So you start right from the surface and just go. They talk a little bit about crosswind considerations during takeoff. Essentially, once you get in the air, you want to enter a crab if there's a bunch of wind. So if the wind is coming from the left, like it is in this picture, you want to point the nose of the helicopter to the left so that your ground track is straight down the runway. When you're down low, you can do a slip. So you can tilt the lift into the wind so that you don't move. So in this picture, these are balancing each other out. There's also ground reference maneuvers, which is kind of interesting. If you do fixed wing training, this is something that you have to do for your check ride. This is something that is mentioned in the helicopter flying handbook, but it's not a required maneuver at all for your check ride. So there's 3 different kinds of ground reference maneuvers. One of them is a rectangular course. And this is basically a traffic pattern where you're adjusting for the wind. So here in the picture, you've got the wind coming this way. If you didn't adjust from the wind, you would have this funny path in the white. So what you're supposed to do is to crab. So here I'm going to crab into the wind. And now I'm running with the wind, so there's no crab angle. And then here I'm going to crab into the wind, which is into the circle in this case. So that's how you fly a rectangular course. There are also S-turns across the road where you come in and you're trying to make a constant radius S-turn as you cross your road or other straight reference on the ground. Again, this is something you don't have to do on your check ride, even if you do a commercial license. but it could be a good skill builder. And if you were doing fixed wing, the most common technique by far that you're going to get asked to do on a check ride is turns around a point, where you have some sort of reference point and you make a constant radius turn over the ground. So you come in ideally downwind, where you have the fastest airspeed, and then you have the steepest bank. So you come in, and then as you start to get about a quarter of the way around, you're going to shallow out the bank because your ground speed's going to start to go down. And then as you go into the wind, halfway there, you're going to have the shallowest bank because you're going the slowest with your ground speed. And then you'll start steepening it up again as you come around. And then once you get back to where you started, you have your steepest bank. Traffic patterns. We fly traffic patterns just like airplanes. However, typically we will fly the opposite pattern. So if they have left traffic at an airport, we might fly right traffic in the helicopter. Also, we might fly lower. It's very common to fly at a 500-foot pattern instead of a 1,000-foot pattern, which is kind of a default for most airplanes. It's going to vary from some airports to another. There's one airport down at Smoketown where they have a lot of helicopter ops. They actually put up signs on the ground that says left traffic for airplanes. And the reason they had to put up the sign is that sometimes you'd see airplanes coming into the airport who weren't familiar, and they would try to join the helicopters in a right pattern. They just thought, oh, it must be right traffic here. Well, it's not. Approaches pretty much the same as they are with an airplane, assuming we're approaching the runway. We have an approach to a hover. That's probably the most commonly done thing. You know, it could be to a runway, it could be to a helipad. You want to pick your point, kind of a reference point, and you want to say, all right, I want that angle. If I look toward that point, I want that angle to stay the same as I'm coming into land. So here's what should happen. Let's say that I'm doing a normal landing. So I'm coming in somewhere between 7 and 15 degrees is the angle, which is a little bit steeper than an airplane. So I come in and I'm looking at my point, and let's say it's even with a compass in my helicopter. As I come in, I'm going to slowly start to slow down by pulling back on the collective. Now, the cyclic. Initially, I'm going to have to drop the collective a little bit so I don't climb. And then as I get a little bit slower, I'm going to be on the backside of that power curve. So then now it's going to take more power to go slow. So I'm coming in and I want to look like my helicopter is on a wire. And it's just going down a wire right to my point where I'm going to land. Now what's going on with that is that I'm just going slower and slower as I get closer to my point. I might be going 60 knots initially. And at the end, I'm going 0. So as I start to slow down, I start to slow my closing rate by pulling aft on the cyclic. I will have to slow down my descent rate by pulling up on the collective. And you have to be careful with how you do that, because you can get into something called settling with power, which we haven't talked about yet. But real quickly, settling with power is a bad situation you can get into with a helicopter. There are 3 conditions that are required for you to get into settling with power. Number 1, you have to have some power applied. Number 2, you have to be below that effective translational lift, or ETL speed, which is 16 to 24 knots. And you have to be descending more than 300 feet per minute. So as you're starting to get to that ETL speed, you want to make sure that your descent rate is not above 300. How do you know when you're getting to ETL? Well, you can look at the airspeed indicator, but you don't have to, because you'll feel it. There's like a shuddering that you're going to feel as you approach that speed. Again, definitely would recommend that you have a look at some of those videos. You can also land on the surface. Again, maybe there's some snow or some dust. You just want to come in and land. Sometimes you have to do a go-around. What's a go-around about? Well, that's what you do when you're coming in to land and maybe there's somebody there. There's a traffic conflict. Maybe it's a towered field and you're told to do a go-around. Or you're coming in and it's not really looking good. You just botch the approach. It's better to do a go-around than to come in and bend something. How do you do a go-around in a helicopter? Well, it's pretty easy. Just pour in the power and go. Airplanes, they have to worry about putting in the power, getting rid of flaps, making sure they have enough speed. In a helicopter, you don't have to worry about that so much. Just pour in the power and go. Start climbing. That's it. You're done. Right. Okay, so those are basic maneuvers in a helicopter, which brings us to the end of chapter 9. So I will see you guys in class later. Have a good one.